David sat across from Clara in the elegant restaurant, his mind still caught up in the endless meetings and phone calls that filled his days, when Clara suddenly froze mid-sentence, her fork trembling slightly in her hand as her eyes drifted past him toward the glass window that overlooked the dimly lit street outside, and when David turned to see what had unsettled her, he found a thin young boy sitting on the cold pavement, knees pulled close to his chest, shivering under the cruel wind, his clothes torn, his shoes barely holding together, his skin pale with hunger, and in that instant Clara's voice broke the silence, her words quiet yet sharp enough to pierce through David's heart as she whispered, "He looks like your dead son, Adam," a name David had not allowed himself to hear in years, a name that still carried the weight of a grave he visited in silence but never spoke of aloud. And at first he wanted to dismiss it, to shake off the thought as a trick of memory or imagination, but when his eyes met the boy's, something inside him faltered because those eyes carried the same kind of sadness that once lived in Adam's gaze, a sadness mixed with hope, the kind of fragile hope a child should never carry. And David felt his breath catch as if the walls around him were closing in, as if the noise of the restaurant had disappeared, leaving only the sound of Clara's words echoing in his ears. And Clara, seeing the change in his face, reached across the table to touch his hand, her fingers pressing softly, urging him to go outside, to not ignore what was right in front of him. And though David's instinct told him to turn away, to bury the memory once more under layers of silence and work, he found himself standing, his chair scraping lightly against the polished floor, his heart pounding with a rhythm he had not felt in years, a rhythm of fear and longing intertwined. And as he stepped out of the restaurant into the biting cold night, he noticed how small the boy looked against the towering city buildings, how out of place he seemed among the rushing cars and glowing lights, as if he belonged to another world, one forgotten by most. And David hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach, unsure whether this was some cruel reminder of his loss or a chance he was meant to take. But when the boy lifted his head, startled by the sound of footsteps, David saw not just hunger, but also an unspoken plea. And though the boy did not say a word, his eyes told a story of nights spent alone, of people passing by without care, of a world that had chosen to forget him. And David's throat tightened, because those were the very same eyes he remembered, looking back at him from the hospital bed years ago, the eyes of a son he could not save. And for a moment, he felt as if the past and present had collided, as if fate itself had placed this child before him, but fear whispered inside him that he was imagining things, that he was too broken to see clearly. And Clara's voice from behind called out gently, reminding him that he wasn't alone, that sometimes life gave reminders not to hurt but to heal. Yet David could not bring himself to speak. He simply stood there, frozen between memory and reality, unsure whether to step forward and ask the boy his name or to turn back and walk away. And the suspense of that decision pressed heavily on his chest, because deep down he knew that whatever choice he made tonight would change not only the boy's life but his own. And with the night growing colder, the lights of the city blurring in his vision, David finally drew in a sharp breath, his mind a storm of grief and unanswered questions. And as he took a step closer, the boy flinched, his body tensing as if ready to flee. And David stopped, realizing how fragile this moment was, how easily it could vanish, how easily he could lose the chance to understand why fate had brought them face to face. And though the street was filled with strangers, honking cars, and hurried footsteps, to David it felt as though the entire world had fallen silent, waiting for his next move. And as his hand stretched out ever so slowly, his voice still locked inside his throat, he knew that the reminder of his lost past had come alive before his eyes. And whether this boy was meant to heal him or haunt him, the answer lay in the words he had yet to speak. David's hand trembled slightly as he finally found his voice and asked the boy his name. And after a moment of hesitation, the child whispered, almost as if afraid of being heard, "Eli," sound so faint it nearly vanished into the noise of the city, yet strong enough to send a shiver down David's spine. For the name, though unfamiliar, carried with it a weight of innocence and pain. And as David looked closer, he saw how Eli's lips were cracked from thirst, how his fingers curled tightly into his thin jacket as if holding on to the last bit of warmth. And suddenly the realization struck him that this boy wasn't just a fleeting image or a reminder of Adam. He was real, breathing, suffering, and entirely alone. And David felt a surge of guilt at the thought of how many times he must have passed children like this before without noticing. But now that the boy's eyes were locked with his, there was no escaping, no looking away, because something in Eli's stare demanded to be acknowledged. And Clara, who had followed David outside, bent down with gentle hands and wrapped her scarf around Eli's small shoulders, the softness of the fabric drawing a flicker of surprise across his face. And in that tiny expression, David recognized something powerful. This child had not felt kindness in a very long time. And as Eli's lips quivered as though he wanted to say thank you but could not bring himself to trust the moment, David's chest tightened, for he understood. That silence was not simply the absence of words but the echo of wounds too deep to express. and though every part of him longed to ask where Eli's parents were, where he came from, why he was alone on such a merciless night, he swallowed the questions, fearing the answers might break whatever fragile bridge was forming between them. And for a while, they stood together in the cold street, the city rushing past, indifferent to the quiet battle unfolding in front of the restaurant. A battle not of fists or fire, but of trust and fear. And when Clara suggested softly that they take the boy somewhere warm, David hesitated, torn between the rational voice in his head, warning him that this was not his responsibility, and the quieter, more persistent voice in his heart, telling him that fate had brought Eli here for a reason. And finally he nodded, motioning for the boy to follow, though Eli remained frozen for a moment, his body tense, his eyes darting from David to Clara, as though searching for a trap, until at last he rose, shakily to his feet, and took one small step forward, and that step, though simple, felt monumental, as if a locked door had opened just a crack. And when they reached David's car, Eli hesitated, again, his eyes widening at the sight of the polished black vehicle, his reflection staring back at him from the glass as if it were a stranger he did not recognize, and for a brief second he looked ready to run. But Clara placed a reassuring hand on his arm, whispering that he was safe, and so with a slow, cautious movement he climbed inside, his small hands gripping the seatbelt as though it were both a shield and a chain. And David, sitting beside him, felt the heavy silence of the ride press against his chest. For Eli said nothing, not a single word, only stared out the window as the city lights flickered past, his reflection in the glass merging with the blurred shapes of strangers on the streets, and David, watching him closely, could sense the silent struggle within, a battle between wanting to believe he was safe and fearing that safety was only an illusion, a fragile dream that would vanish the moment he closed his eyes. And when they finally arrived at David's mansion, Eli froze once more at the sight of the towering house, its glowing lights spilling out into the dark night, its gates opening slowly, like the mouth of a world he had never known. And David realized that to Eli this place must look like something out of a storybook, too unreal to belong to him, and when they stepped inside, the warmth of the home seemed to overwhelm him, his eyes darting from the chandelier to the wide staircase to the polished floors. And instead of joy, David saw confusion and fear in those eyes, for Eli's silence was not from ingratitude but from disbelief, as though he feared he would wake up back on the street if he dared to trust this kindness. And when Clara guided him to a chair and offered him food, Eli hesitated, his trembling fingers reaching slowly toward the plate, then pulling back, then reaching again, until finally he took a small bite, chewing as if unsure whether the food was truly his. And in that moment David felt a sharp pang of sorrow, realizing that hunger had not only stolen from Eli's body, but had also robbed him of the simple belief that he deserved to eat. And as the boy sat there in silence, eating carefully, his eyes darting nervously toward David every few seconds, David understood that Eli's struggle was not just about finding warmth or food, but about learning to trust again, to believe that kindness was real, and the weight of that truth pressed heavily on David's heart, because he knew that winning that trust would not happen in a single night. It would take patience, time, and more than words could offer. And yet, as he watched Eli, so fragile, and yet so strong to have survived so much, David knew he could not turn back now, because this silent struggle was no longer Eli's alone, it had become his as well. When David led Eli through the grand hallway of his mansion, the boy's small footsteps echoed against the marble floor, each step hesitant, as if afraid the ground might vanish beneath him, and his wide eyes darted to every corner of the house, tall chandelier dripping with crystals, the paintings lined across the walls, the large staircase curling upward like something out of a fairy tale. Yet instead of wonder there was a quiet unease in his face, the look of someone who had stepped into a world that didn't belong to him. And David felt his own throat tighten because while he had lived here for years, this house had never felt more alive than it did now, though its life was not without shadows, for every corner of it still held echoes of his son, Adam. Laughter that once rang down the hallways, the sound of small feet racing up the stairs, the sight of toys left scattered across the living room, untouched since the day tragedy had stolen the boy away. And as David walked, he could almost hear that laughter again, almost see Adam running past him. And then his gaze fell upon a framed photograph on the wall, one he had avoided for so long, showing Adam with his bright eyes and crooked smile. And when Eli paused in front of it, staring intently, his lips parted in quiet shock, whispering words that seemed almost stolen from the air itself. "He looked just like me." The sound was so faint, yet heavy enough to send shivers down David's spine. And he turned quickly, his face shadowed with grief, his chest aching with memories he had locked away for years. And for a long moment, none of them spoke. The silence broken only by the ticking of the tall clock in the hallway, its sound louder than ever, counting seconds that felt like centuries, until Clara stepped forward and gently touched Eli's shoulder, guiding him away from the photograph, though her eyes lingered on David, who stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides as though he were holding himself together by sheer force. and when they finally reached the guest room prepared for Eli, the boy looked at the neatly made bed, the soft pillows, the folded blankets, and instead of jumping into it with excitement, he stood in the doorway, stiff and uncertain, his body almost shaking, as though he feared that if he touched it, it would disappear, and Clara whispered softly, "It's yours now," but Eli still did not move, and it was only when David gave a small nod, his voice rough but firm, that Eli cautiously stepped forward, his fingers brushing against the blanket, pulling it back slowly, and then lowering himself onto the bed, as though afraid the softness might swallow him whole. And when his head finally rested on the pillow, his eyes fluttered closed for a moment, but they opened again quickly, as if he did not trust sleep. And David, watching from the doorway, felt a mix of sorrow and anger, sorrow for the boy's pain and anger at the world that had allowed a child to grow so unfamiliar with comfort. Though he wanted to step closer, to tell Eli he was safe now, the words stuck in his throat, for he knew trust could not be commanded. It had to be earned, and so he stood silently, his mind a storm of memories of nights when Adam had called for him after a nightmare, nights when he had rushed in to hold him, and now standing in front of another child, lying in fear on a bed too big for his small body. David felt the past and present colliding in ways that tore at his heart, and when Clara finally guided him away, whispering that Eli needed rest, David walked down the hall slowly, every step heavier than the last, his thoughts clouded with images of his son, until he found himself in the old playroom, untouched since Adam's passing, where dust had settled over forgotten toys. Shelves lined with books that had not been opened, and on the desk lay a drawing Adam had made of their family, David, Clara, and himself holding hands with a smiling stick figure boy, and the sight of it nearly broke him, for now, in the quiet light of memory, Eli's face overlapped with Adam's in his mind, not as a replacement but as a haunting resemblance, and though he knew he could never bring Adam back, he also knew Eli had been brought into his life for a reason he could not yet understand, a reason that filled him with both fear and hope. And as the night stretched on, shadows lengthening across the mansion, David found himself pacing restlessly, his heart unwilling to let go of the boy sleeping down the hall, for he knew that taking Eli in was not just an act of kindness, it was the beginning of something that would either heal him or shatter him further, and that uncertainty hung over him like a storm, leaving him wide awake in a house full of memories, waiting to see if the silence of the past would finally give way to the voice of the present. The first few days in the mansion passed slowly, and though Eli had a bed, food, and warmth, the shadows of his past clung to him like a second skin, for he would eat quietly, hiding pieces of bread in his pockets as if afraid tomorrow might bring hunger again, and he would glance over his shoulder whenever footsteps echoed in the hall, his body stiffening as though expecting someone to push him back into the cold. And David, watching him closely, understood that no matter how safe Eli's surroundings were, his heart was still locked behind walls built from fear. And one evening, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder shook the skies, David heard the faint sound of footsteps in the corridor outside his bedroom, and when he opened the door, he saw Eli standing there, his small frame trembling, his eyes wide with the kind of terror that storms awaken in children who have no one to hold them, and without thinking, David reached out, his hand resting gently on Eli's shoulder, and whispered, "It's all right, you're safe here." And though the boy hesitated for a long moment, his body rigid, as though unsure whether to believe the words, at last he allowed himself to step forward, burying his face against David's chest, and David felt something inside him shatter and mend all at once, for it was the first time since Adam's death that he held a child so close. The warmth of Eli's fragile body against him, stirring memories of nights long gone when Adam had run to him in fear. And in that embrace, David realized this boy was no longer just a reminder of loss. He was someone reaching desperately for trust, and from that night a shift began, subtle but powerful. As Eli slowly started breaking the silence that had caged him, asking small questions in a soft voice, "Will there be food tomorrow, or can I stay here again?" And each time David answered with patience, assuring him that this home was his now. Though deep down David knew words alone could not erase years of fear, and so he showed it through actions. Sitting with Eli during meals, teaching him how to play simple games, reading books aloud even when Eli pretended not to listen, until little by little the boy's wary eyes began to soften. But the struggle was far from over. For one afternoon when Clara brought him a box of new clothes, Eli refused to wear them, clutching his old torn jacket tightly against his chest as if it were a shield, and when David gently asked why, Eli's voice cracked as he whispered, "It's all I have left from before." And David said nothing, simply kneeling beside him, and letting him hold on, for he understood that sometimes walls do not fall with force but crumble with time. And then came the day when David entered the playroom, long untouched, and found Eli sitting on the floor surrounded by Adam's toys, his fingers tracing the lines of a small wooden car, his eyes full of both wonder and guilt. And when Eli looked up, fear flickered across his face, as if he had trespassed into a sacred space. But instead of anger, David sat beside him, picked up another toy, and said softly, These belong to Adam, my son, and Eli, after a long silence, whispered, did he like them? And in that simple question, David felt his heart tremble, because it was the first time Eli had acknowledged the boy whose absence still haunted the house. And so he told him stories of Adam's laughter, his mischief, his love for climbing trees and drawing pictures, and Eli listened with wide eyes, as though trying to weave those stories into his own world, and from that day a fragile thread connected them, not of replacement but of shared memory, and yet trust is never built without tests. For one evening when a guest visited David, Eli overheard the man's careless words about taking in strays, and the boy's face darkened, his walls rising higher than ever, and he locked himself in his room, refusing to eat, refusing to speak, until David sat outside his door for hours, saying nothing, just waiting, and when Eli finally cracked the door open, his eyes wet, he whispered, will you send me back? And David, without hesitation, answered, never, pulling him into his arms once more, and in that moment Eli's silent struggle began to crumble, replaced with the fragile courage to believe he belonged. And though storms of doubt still lingered, though shadows of the streets still haunted his dreams, the bond between them was growing stronger, one brick of trust at a time, until the mansion no longer felt like a house of ghosts, but like a place where healing had begun. And David, for the first time in years, felt the walls around his own heart break as well, leaving space not just for memories of Adam, but for the living child before him who needed love just as deeply. The weeks slowly turned into months, and the mansion that once stood as a monument of silence and grief now began to echo with new sounds. For Eli's laughter, hesitant at first, started to fill the hallways, and his small footsteps no longer carried fear but a playful rhythm. Yet even as the atmosphere shifted, there remained a delicate suspense in the air, as if everyone in the house knew that trust, though blooming, was fragile, and one wrong moment could still send Eli back into the shadows he had lived in for so long. And David, who once moved through life with the cold precision of a man bound only to work, now found himself waiting eagerly to return home each evening, for he would open the door and see Eli rushing to greet him, sometimes hiding behind a corner to jump out in playful surprise, and sometimes simply standing there, smiling shyly as though still unsure he deserved to belong. And with each day David's heart grew lighter, though a small fear always lingered. Fear that the world outside, with its cruel voices and careless judgments, would remind Eli that he was once a forgotten boy on the street. And that fear was tested one afternoon when Eli came home from school with downcast eyes, clutching his bag tightly against his chest, refusing to speak until David knelt before him and gently coaxed the truth. And Eli whispered that other children had laughed at his old shoes, saying he did not belong in their world. And David felt a wave of anger rise within him, but he steadied his voice, telling Eli softly that belonging was not given by clothes or by wealth but by love, and that he was loved here more than he could ever imagine. And slowly, those words began to sink into the boy's guarded heart. For later that evening, Eli placed his small hand in David's, a gesture of silent trust that spoke louder than any words. And Clara, watching them from the doorway, felt tears sting her eyes, for she knew that both man and boy had been broken in different ways and were now learning to heal each other. Yet healing was not without its trials, for there were nights when Eli would still wake in terror, whispering of streets, hunger, and shadows that chased him in his dreams. And David, once afraid of facing his own grief, now found himself sitting beside Eli's bed until sleep claimed him again, sometimes telling him stories of Adam, not to replace one boy with another, but to weave their lives together in truth. And in those quiet hours, David realized something powerful, that love did not vanish when death came. It transformed, finding new ways to live, and Eli, in his innocence, was helping him understand that. And as the seasons turned, papers were signed, and the boy who once had no name in the world was now legally his son. The day of adoption marked not by grand celebrations but by a simple promise spoken in the judge's chamber, when David leaned down and whispered to Eli, "You are mine now, forever." And Eli, with trembling lips, whispered back, "And you are my father?" And those words sealed a bond no storm could break. And when they returned home that evening, Clara prepared a small dinner, the three of them sitting together, laughter breaking through what was once silence, and David felt the mansion, once a house of memories and ghosts, transform into a home, alive and whole. And yet the suspense of life did not vanish. For David knew challenges would come, questions from outsiders, fears that might resurface, memories that might hurt, but he no longer dreaded them. For he had something stronger than fear now. He had Eli's trust, and Eli had his. And that was enough to face anything ahead. And one golden afternoon, as the sun poured over the garden, David stood watching Eli kick a football across the grass, his laughter echoing against the walls. And in that sound, David heard something he thought he had lost forever, the melody of a child's joy filling the air with life. And Clara, stepping beside him, whispered softly, "Sometimes life doesn't give us back what we lost. It gives us something new to heal us." And David, his eyes wet but his heart steady, nodded, for he understood that Adam's memory would forever live inside him, but Eli's presence had opened a door he thought was sealed forever, a door to love, to family, to hope. And as Eli ran toward him, calling out, "Dad, look," with the kind of excitement only a child can hold, David felt the past no longer as a chain but as a foundation, and in that moment, under the bright sky and the sound of laughter, the story of grief had finally turned into a story of new beginnings, one that promised not perfection but the strength to face the unknown together. And for the first time in years, David no longer felt like a man haunted by loss, but like a father given a second chance at life.